Hey guys, welcome back to another Destiny 2 video. In today's video, I'm going to go over one of the best Solar 3.0 builds I have made to date, simply because of the survivability that this build has. While we don't have as much DPS as the similar build that I put out earlier for Titan with Solar 3.0 featuring Syntheseps, this is undoubtedly one of the best builds anytime you want to solo content, do endgame content, or just looking for ways to get through more difficult PvE encounters. The survivability for this build, as well as the natural damage resistance that we can potentially achieve, is unmatched in PvE, and therefore it makes it my go-to build for any kind of solo or endgame attempts on Titan. Before we get into it, be sure to like and subscribe for more Destiny 2 content like this, and let me know down in the comments below what you thought of this build, as well as suggestions for this build, or suggestions for future builds. I have a few more in the works, and coming up next week, we actually have a hunter build, so stay tuned for that. Getting right into today though, we are on Solar 3.0. Super really doesn't matter for this build. I'm personally using Burning Maul because I got a 25% damage buff in PvE recently, but you can use whatever fits your playstyle. And I'm also using the Throwing Hammer ability as well as the Healing Grenade ability. As far as aspects go, the first is Soul Invictus, which allows our solar ability Final Blows, Hammer of Soul impacts, and defeating Scorched targets to spawn sunspots, which entering them then gives us increased ability regen, as well as Restoration, which Restoration is some of the best natural healing in the entire game. I'm also using Roaring Flames, which allows our Final Blows with solar abilities or ignitions to increase the damage of our solar abilities up to 3 stacks. And this becomes very noticeable whenever it's affecting both our Throwing Hammer ability with this build and our super damage. Finally, onto our fragments. Our first is Ember of Singeing, which our class ability recharges faster when we scorch targets, which is going to be incredibly easy to do with this build. Ember of Empyrean, which allows solar weapon or ability Final Blows to extend the duration of Radiant and Restoration, which are both incredibly potent with Solar 3.0. Ember of Benevolence, which whenever we apply Restoration, Cure, or Radiant to allies, it grants us increased grenade melee and class ability regen. And then Ember of Torches, which powered melee attacks against combatants make us and nearby allies radiant. So again, you can already see a lot of the synergy with this build. Ember of Benevolence proccing from both our powered melee and our grenade. Ember of Empyrean granting us increase to our radiant and restoration effects that are being applied from our Throwing Hammer and from sunspots, as well as Ember of Singeing giving us a way to get our class ability back faster, which is another way we can proc Restoration and Restoration times 2. Getting right into the armor and the exotic for today is Lorely Splendor Helm. Whenever we are critically wounded, meaning whenever our shields are depleted and we're down to red health, Lorely Splendor Helm will consume our barricade and spawn a sunspot at our location with increased healing effects, giving us Restoration times 2. Now, I often have a nickname for Restoration times 2, which is Invincibility with a timer, because the healing you get from Restoration times 2 is unmatched in Destiny 2. It is some of the best intrinsic healing in the entire game, and it increases your health so fast that it basically negates any and all damage that isn't instantly one-shotting you. I'm also pairing this with Font of Might. Our solar weapons will benefit from a 25% increased weapon damage, which can also stack on top of Radiant. I'm also pairing this with Linear Fusion Rifle Ammo Finder and Harmonic Siphon just to benefit from the weapons we're using. If you want to swap these out to fit your playstyle and whatever weapons you're equipping with this build, go for it. Next, onto our gauntlets. The first mod is Protective Light, which while we're charged with light, we gain a 10% damage resistance against combatants while our shields are destroyed, and this consumes all of our stacks, and based on the number of stacks that we have, it increases the duration of this effect. For those who don't know, this actually got quite a heavy nerf at the start of Witch Queen, where it went from 50% down to 10%, and although it's only a 10% damage resistance, when on its own isn't really that much, we're going to be combining it with a lot of other damage resistance values, which really amp up the potency of our total damage resistance for our build. I'm also combining this with Focusing Strike, and Focusing Strike grants us class ability energy when we cause damage with a melee attack, and considering the fact we're going to be throwing our hammer nearly constantly with this build, this is going to give our barricade back in no time at all when we do expend it through Loreley. Next up onto our chest piece is Melee Wellmaker, which powered melee combat Final Blows spawn elemental wells matching the type of our subclass. In this case, it's going to be solar. Again, another great way to spawn solar elemental wells for this build. And I'm combining it with a stack of Armor of the Dying Star and arc resistance to give us a 25% damage resistance to arc, solar, and void damage. Quickly going into the intrinsic damage resistance for this build, again, we are going to be at tier 10 resilience, not only giving us the highest barricade regen in the entire game, but also giving us an intrinsic 40% damage reduction in PvE. This 40% can then stack on top of the 25% for those damage effects that are relevant, as well as the 10% from Protective Light. Again, while this 10% might be minor on its own, when combined with these other two resistances, it actually amps up our damage resistance pretty noticeably. and creates one of the best environments where whenever Lorely actually procs and consumes her barricade to grant us restoration, we then also get that additional 10% damage resistance on top of that, ensuring that whatever got us down to that low health point in the first place isn't going to be able to against basically invincibility with a timer, as well as a 10% damage resistance on top of a 40% damage resistance on top of specific 25% damage resistances, making us one of the tankiest and fastest regening builds in the entire game. And I'll even show you how to get even more damage resistance in a little bit. Next up, onto our legs. The first mod is Well of Life. In short, picking up a solar elemental well grants us increased regeneration for a short period of time. This regeneration isn't really anything comparable to restoration, and especially not to restoration times 2, but it does stack on top of it, giving us a little bit of a bump to our health regen as a whole. If you don't want to rely on Well of Life though, you can always substitute it for something like Well of Ordnance, which grants us increased grenade energy on picking up solar elemental wells, or Bountiful Wells, which just gives us a second well every time we spawn a well. However, Well of Life's effect is noticeable with base restoration, and again, it's simply bumping the effectiveness of our restorative effects. I'm also using Absolution, which reduces all of our ability cooldowns each time we pick up an orb of power, and Recuperation, which replenishes health each time we pick up an orb as well. And then finally, onto our class mark, we have Elemental Charge, which we become charged with life by picking up an elemental well, and if it matches our subclass, in this case Solar, it'll grant us 2 stacks of Charge with Light instead of 1. It is a fantastic way that synergizes well with this build to reliably always have Protective Light active if we need it. The other mods I'm using are Flame Harvesting, which allows Solar Exotic Final Blows to create Solar Elemental Wells, and I'm actually going to be using a weapon that isn't a Solar Exotic that still benefits from Flame Harvesting, and I'll go into that later, but already off the top of my head, stuff like Sunshot, stuff like Tiku's Divination, Prometheus Lens, and Jotun would all be fantastic options to pair with this. Then also Solar Fulmination, which makes our ignitions have increased radius and damage, although I've been seeing a lot of reports that Solar Fulmination is currently bugged. So if you want to swap this out with something like Bomber, for example, and get your grenade back faster, you can totally do that and then wait till Solar Fulmination is addressed and equip it back on. Quickly going over some of the damage resistance and restorative effects with this build, you might be noticing that Well of Tenacity isn't present, and that's a personal choice of mine, but if you wanted to spec into Well of Tenacity and using something like Reaping Wellmaker and combining that with Well of Tenacity, you totally could and receive an additional 50% damage resistance for a few seconds when you pick up a Void Elemental Well. The main reason I'm not is a personal choice, and that has to deal with how Lorely actually functions and the overall purpose of this build. Again, the purpose of this build isn't to simply tank damage and always stay at full health, it's to simply stay alive at all times and rely on our restoration effects, and especially restoration times 2, as well as some already decent damage resistance to never die in the first place. When I was testing Well of Tenacity and constantly using my barricade to try to get those few seconds of an additional 50% damage resistance, it became pretty obvious that there were some situations where I didn't have my barricade that I actually really could have used it. And the big thing was we were consuming our barricade charge that would prevent Lorely from activating, and using it to just gain a few seconds of 50% damage resistance when we were mainly relying on restoration to actually heal us in the first place. Now don't get me wrong, Well of Tenacity's 50% damage resistance on top of, again, a 10% from Protective Light, 25% from our armor-based mods today, and 40% intrinsically from Resilience is incredibly noticeable, and you basically can't be killed by anything except for maybe a raid boss or in endgame content, a boss or champion. The damage resistance at that point is absolutely absurd, and again, we can go even further, and I'll get into that in a second, but I always viewed it as overkill, and I would rather support Lorely as a function of restoration times 2 instead of just flat out damage resistance, because again, restoration times 2 doesn't really even need any further damage resistance to support it, as it already gives us some of the best healing in the entire game, and it's absolutely absurd how much damage it allows us to tank with our healing. But again, if you want to go full on damage resistance, you can totally do that and equip Well of Tenacity and find your preferred way to spawn Void Elemental Wells. A thing I want to note about that though is Lorely Splendor Helm's consumption of your barricade charge does not function as you using that barricade charge. What I mean by that is, as earlier as I mentioned, Reaping Wellmaker and also Bomber as a potential mod options. When Lorely Splendor Helm consumes your barricade, it doesn't actually proc those effects. Meaning that if you're using something like Reaping Wellmaker and assuming that when Lorely procs, you can then just have on Well of Tenacity, get a weapon kill, and spawn a Void Elemental Well, it doesn't actually work properly because you're not actually activating your barricade. Meaning that you have to manually use your barricade in order to use stuff like Reaping Wellmaker or Bomber, for instance. So I highly recommend keeping that in mind, as it doesn't intrinsically work as you might expect it to at first. Instead of going to our exotic, because it is really up to you, I'm actually going with a weapon that works with Flame Harvesting, which in this case is DRANG, believe it or not. DRANG is the other half to the Sturm combination, and because of this, it actually is granted compatibility with Flame Harvesting, meaning that this gets intrinsic elemental armaments through Flame Harvesting, preventing us from taking up a combat style mod. And of course, this stacks with Font of Might for our damage values. And overall, it's just an incredible ad clear weapon considering the perks that this can roll with. And again, we can actually take advantage of flame harvesting without ever using our exotic slot, which is a huge advantage of using Drang. I don't have the pattern unlocked yet, so I don't have any enhanced perk rolls. However, you can already get Incandescent on it, which is one of the best weapon perks for solar-based builds, because when you defeat a target, it spreads Scorch to nearby targets, which of course we can take advantage with various fragments and other abilities. As far as other weapons go, you can really use whatever is fitting your playstyle. Again, some other good exotics that'll work well are Jotun, Prometheus Lens, Sunshot, and Tiku's Divination. I'm actually using Wither Horde though, just as a decent ad clear weapon, and also some passive DPS. I also recommend the Cataclysmic, although I don't have the best roll on it and I don't have the pattern unlocked yet. Stuff like Storm Chaser from the new Duality Dungeon is also a really good heavy weapon. Some other heavy weapons I recommend would be Parasite and Galahorn, which again already do really high damage, and with Font of Might and Radiant on top can deal incredible amounts of damage. And these can also benefit from Flame Harvesting, which allow it to spawn those solar elemental wells we rely on. Another weapon I want to take the time to actually point out and recommend you try if you're interested in even more damage resistance is Explosive Personality. Explosive Personality can roll with a variety of traits. I'm personally using Autoloading Holster and Disruption Break, both of which are enhanced, just for better synergy, as Autoloading Holster just enables you to simply swap to this weapon, fire it, and after a few seconds of swapping away, it reloads itself, and Disruption to give us increased kinetic damage when we break a target shield. But the main reason we're using it is Land Tank. And for those who don't know, every time we get a kill with this weapon, we get a stack of Land Tank, up to 3 stacks. For every stack of Land Tank that we get +1 tier resilience, and we also get +5 damage resistance. Meaning at times 3 stacks, we get an additional 3 tiers of resilience and 15% damage resistance. Given the fact that we're already at tier 10 resilience, we can't really take advantage of the additional resilience values. However, we can take advantage of the 15% damage resistance, which again, when stacking on top of what we already have with 10%, 40%, and 25% in specific scenarios, an additional 15% is absolutely absurd, and again, just takes us build to the next level if that's what you're looking for. If you combine this with Law of Tenacity, that's an additional 50% damage resistance, which is just absolutely absurd and is basically overkill for everything outside of endgame content. Despite Land Tank being a little bit shorter than what it used to be last season with the removal of the seasonal mods that increase its duration, it still synergizes really well with this build. On its own, Autoloading Holster complements it perfectly because you can get a few kills with it, being a Waveframe grenade launcher, swap off of it, get a few kills, swap back and get another kill to keep that buff actually going. But on top of that, it's also a solar weapon, so it can also benefit from Font of Might. It is overall a great alternative to something like Drang if you're interested. And then just a final note as well, the reason I'm not including the Callus mini tool is actually because it doesn't synergize with Flame Harvesting, despite Midas synergy actually combining with something like Nita Multi-Tool. But that's pretty much it for the build today, guys. Like I said, this is my go-to to any kind of solo content where I need to focus on surviving and completing a run rather than trying to do it quickly with higher DPS but more risky options. It's definitely a favorite of mine and something I'm going to be using continually through Season 17 and probably well into the future with the changes that Solar 3.0 actually brought, as something like Restoration ×2 is again invincibility with the timer, and with the natural damage resistance we're experiencing with a build like this, it's truly incredible, and definitely, in my opinion, a build well deserving of the spotlight. But let me know what you thought of it down below, as well as suggestions for future videos, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.